everyone. I am back again with another bizarre but true case. And this one I thought was pretty interesting because it is about the Biosphere 2 experiment that took place in Arizona in the early 90s. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is, basically Biosphere 2 was an ecosystem that was created inside a bunch of biodomes. And a crew of 8 people was selected to go in there and live inside for 2 years to see the viability of that kind of environment for sustaining human life. And the goal of the experiment was partly to see if humans could survive in there in the event of a huge man-made disaster like a nuclear war, or eventually space travel. So if they wanted to colonize Mars or a planet that didn't sustain human life naturally and didn't have what we needed, if they could create Earth's atmosphere and conditions within a biodome, and if people could survive in that environment for very long. And what was really cool about this experiment, it was considered an epic failure, because basically what happened is you were dealing with 2 elements. You were dealing with people having to manage the biosphere, and I'll get more into the details about what that included, but they had to manage the biosphere and everything that was going on, so maintain the environmental conditions, but they also had to deal with the psychological effects of living in a small group with just 8 other people for 2 years. And they actually divided into factions during it, and there was a lot of conspiracy and arguments about how to run the experiment, how to manage their materials and supplies, and just there was a lot of general chaos that you would get from 8 adults living together with no break from each other in this contained environment. So they had no contact with the outside world at all. They were just locked in these domes. And it was actually a really sophisticated experiment because they were creating different ecological systems from around the world. So they were, the rainforests and the Everglades and the ocean, and basically these scientists had to maintain and see how these environmental conditions progressed. And it was also sustaining their food supply because it was an agriculture thing. So they had animals in there they had to raise, and they had a very specific diet they had to follow. So there were a lot of stressors that went into this. So the article I saw, they actually called them the Crazy 8. And so, like I said, it was 8 people who went into the biodome. So here's some more detail about it. In 1987, an American Earth Science Research Facility was constructed in Oracle, Arizona. It was designed to replicate Earth's ecosystems and was meant to demonstrate the viability of closed ecological systems to support and maintain life in outer space. It was designed with various biological biomes. The initial team that was sent in were considered biospherians, and the goal was to see, like I said, if they could live in these biospheres and maintain that environment and work together cohesively for the duration of the experiment, which was 2 years. So Biosphere 2 was actually, this experiment was attempted twice. The first one was 1991 to 93, and the second one was March to September in 1994, so that one was less than a year. And both these, they were very highly publicized about what they were going to do, but they ran into a lot of problems, namely low amounts of food and oxygen. A lot of the animals died during the experiment, and the plants that were included, a lot of them died or they couldn't be maintained. And like I said, one of the biggest things was there was a lot of politics and power struggles, sort of a Lord of the Flies moment where people start, questioning what is the other group doing, how should we be managing things, and there was a lot going on. So, but this experiment did set a lot of world records in closed ecological systems and about the potential healthy improvements if you have a low-calorie, high-nutrient diet. So it did do some really good research, and it gave us a lot of information about small group dynamics. So although this experiment wasn't super successful overall, there was a lot that was learned from it. So the project in itself was originally launched in 1984 by businessman and philanthropist Ed Bass and systems ecologist John P. Allen. and Bass actually provided $150 million in funding for the project. And these two men had originally met at Synergia Ranch, which was a counterculture community that was run by Allen in the 70s. And they brought up this idea based on Buckminster Fuller's Spaceship Earth concept. And it was there were a lot of members that were in this ranch that actually jumped on board and were a part of Biosphere 2 as a project. So what did Biosphere 2 consist of? It was an above-ground structure made of steel tubing and high-performance glass and steel frames, so literally domes on the ground. And the frame and glazing materials were designed and made to specification by a one-time associate of Buckminster Fuller, and his name was Peter John Pierce. And the window seals and structure had to be designed to be almost perfectly airtight, such that the air exchange would be extremely low, permitting tracking of subtle changes over time. The patented airtight sealing methods developed by Pierce achieved a leak rate of less than 10% per year. Without such a tight closure, the slow decline of oxygen, which occurred at a rate of less than 0.25% per month during the first 2-year closure experiment, might not have been observed. So it was really important that they were not losing their oxygen supply while they were in there. And since opening a window wasn't an option, the structure also required a sophisticated system to regulate temperatures within desired parameters, which varied with each different biomic area. So though cooling was the largest energy need because they were in the freaking desert, heating also had to be supplied because the desert gets cold at night, and I guess it gets a little chillier in the winter. And so they had closed loop pipes and air handlers as a part of this energy system. An energy center on site provided electricity and heated and cooled water, employing natural gas and backup generators, ammonia chillers, and water cooling towers. So, this original group of 8 went in on September 26th, 1991. So, we're almost at an anniversary of that. And the crew included medical doctor and researcher Roy Walford, Jane Pointer, Tabor McCollum, Mark Nelson, Sally Silverstone, Abigail Alling, Mark Van Thelo, and Linda Lay. So the agriculture system inside of the biodomes produced 83% of their total diet, and it included crops of bananas, papayas, sweet potatoes, beets, peanuts, loblog, cowpea beans, rice, and wheat. And during the first year of the experiment, everybody complained that they were hungry all the time, although according to the calculations and research, they were actually producing a lot of food during that time and exceeded the highest producing other country, agricultural driven country like China, Bangladesh, and Indonesia during that time. So they had a lot of food available. And they followed a very strict diet, though, that was very low calorie and nutrient dense, and it had been designed by Roy Walford in his research. So he designed the diet, and the whole point was to tell whether or not this type of diet would expand your life and improve your health overall. And a lot of the people who were in the experiment did show positive impacts to their health after being on this diet for so long. A lot of them lost about 16% of their body weight, their original body weight, when they went in. But again, they were complaining about being hungry, so take that how you will. They had lower blood cholesterol, low blood pressure, and overall their immune systems were working better. So the diet showed a lot of positive impact. But they did say that in the second year, they started to gain their weight back. So the weight thing, I don't, take that with a grain of salt. So some of the domestic animals that were included in the agricultural area of the first mission included 4 African pygmy goats and 1 billy goat, 35 hens and 3 roosters, Japanese silky bantam, 2 sows, and 1 boar. And there was also tilapia in there as well for them. So this strategy was called species backpacking and was practiced to ensure that food webs and ecological functions could be maintained if some species didn't survive. So basically it was packing them all in so they had a variety. They had a good base so that if the animals started to die off, they would be able to still support the needs of the Biosphereans during that time. But they did say that there was a lot of issues with the different biodomes, because part of the problem is when you try to artificially recreate a certain ecological system, you can't always account for natural elements that will impact it. So if there's too much moisture in a desert recreation, if the rainforest isn't having certain natural effects where they develop what was specifically, it was called stress wood, because they normally created those in response to natural winds that they couldn't recreate in that biosphere. So the environments weren't exact and they were having problems maintaining it throughout the experiment. They also needed to maintain the water levels in their recreated ocean environment, the pH levels and the carbonate, the calcium carbonate, so that the coral would survive. So they had a lot going on. These 8 people were just walking around these different domes, and they had huge amounts of tasks every day to maintain it. And then they were also responsible for the research that was going on. So in addition to maintaining their environment, they were doing experiments. So they had a lot going on, and a lot was going wrong. So a lot of the evidence for isolated human groups comes from psychological studies of scientists that were in Antarctica for long periods of time. And it's called a confined environment psychology phenomenon, according to Jane Pointer. And basically what it does is it looks at how being confined in a small environment with the same group of people can lead to splitting into factions, which was exactly what happened in this situation. Before the mission was half over, the group had split into 2 groups, and people who had been really close at the start of the experiment started to kind of hate and not like each other and started not talking to each other during it. So too much of a good thing being around each other all the time. But they did continue to work together throughout the experiment, so that's something to be noted. Like, I compared it to Lord of the Flies earlier, but it didn't break down. They still all really cared about the success of the experiment. What became the issue was whether or not they felt like they were working towards the same goals. One group was more the survival and maintaining that, and another group was more like the project and the management and just the mission goals. So that's kind of where that divide came in about how to really, what qualified the mission being a success and how they needed to work towards their goals. But they did have the common goal of they wanted the biosphere to work. It was just the nuts and bolts of that project that they differed on. So that did create a bond between them. So it wasn't like the biodomes were war zones or anything like that. They did continue to work together to maintain it, but they had a lot of fights and a lot of who should be in charge once they were in there, because they had varying different opinions about how they needed to manage it long term. So basically the factions inside the bubble formed into a rift, and a power struggle continued as they went on. And basically, according to Time magazine, the veneer of credibility, already bruised by allegations of tamper-prone data, secret food caches, and smuggled supplies, has cracked. The 2-year experiment in self-sufficiency is starting to look less like science and more like a $150 million stunt. And so basically, the outside world was aware of kind of what was going on in the biosphere and the fact that they were having problems. But they said that what also contributed to the issues between the crew was the lack of oxygen that was occurring, and then this calorie-reduced diet. So it was stress, and stress will do it every time. So in November 1992, the hungry Biosphereans began eating seed stocks that had not been grown inside Biosphere 2. And that's because they were hungry. They were hungry, and they were isolated, and they just, they were getting very emotional during that time. I imagine a struggle over seeds, like hardcore, like, them. Yes, we can. That was kind of what was going on, because that was one of the things about whether or not that jeopardized the experiment if they were eating things that weren't a part of it, which I kind of agree it is. The whole point was that they were self-sustaining, so if they were bringing in supplies that they didn't have, or somehow getting supplies, then, you know, it's kind of cheating and you're sort of proving that you can't do it. But so some of the challenges were, among the problems and miscalculations encountered in the first mission were unanticipated condensation making the desert too wet, population explosions of greenhouse ants and cockroaches, morning glories overgrowing in the rainforest area, blocking out other plants, and less sunlight entering the facility than originally anticipated. And the Biosphereans interweaved to control invasive plants when needed to preserve biodiversity, functioning as keystone predators. In addition, construction itself was a challenge. For example, it was difficult to manipulate the bodies of waters to have waves and make tidal changes. Engineers came up with innovative solutions to supplement natural functions of the Earth's biosphere that normally get performed, such as vacuum pumps to recreate the ocean, and then different heating and cooling systems. And it was, all of the technology was designed to minimize outgassing and discharge of harmful substances, which might damage life in Biosphere too. So again, they can't recreate what the Earth is doing naturally, and this group of 8 was not enough to do it. So there was also controversy when the public learned that the project had allowed an injured member to leave and return carrying new material inside. The team claimed the only new supplies brought in were plastic bags, but others accused them of bringing in food and other items. More criticism was raised when they learned that likewise the project injected oxygen in January 1993 to make up for a failure in the balance of the system, which resulted in the oxygen steadily declining. Some thought that this criticism ignored the fact that Biosphere 2 was an experiment where the unexpected would occur, adding to the knowledge of the complex ecologies developed and interact, and not a demonstration where everything was known in advance. So you've got some people that say basically this experiment's a fraud because they're getting new supplies and we've proven it doesn't work, basically. So that was where you were getting a lot of criticism of this experiment, that they were trying to make adjustments as it went along, and people are going, the whole point was that you created this environment and they shouldn't be touched for 2 years. Like, they should have to deal with any challenges that are in there. So, but on the other side, these are 8 volunteers that went into this, and you don't want them to die or suffer for a year because they don't have oxygen or enough food. So it's, one of those drawing the lines kind of thing. So, praise and criticism of this experiment. One view of Biosphere 2 was that it was the most exciting scientific project to ever be undertaken in the United States since Kennedy launched towards the moon. Others call it a New Age drivel masquerading as science. John Allen and Roy Walford did have mainstream credentials. John Allen held a degree in metallurgic mining engineering from Colorado School of Mines and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Roy Walford received his doctorate of medicine from the University of Chicago and taught at UCLA as a professor of pathology for 35 years. Nelson obtained his PhD under Professor H.T. Odom in ecological engineering. So, and it looks like most of the people who are in this Biosphere had a PhD or advanced degrees. I'm not going to read through this whole list, but they all had a lot of experience in the areas that they were in. So they were credible scientists when they went in. They weren't a bunch of, just random people off the street who would go, like, here, create an ecosystem and maintain it. So they did have some credibility and training going in there. But again, the public's like, but they failed. Basically, halfway through, they've proven that they can't do this, and they needed help. So that's the big criticism of it. So basically, when the experiment ended, they came out of the sphere, and it was, hit or miss about whether or not the public thought about the experiment and the success and whether or not it proved it. But, let me see. According to the Scientific Advisory Committee, chaired by Tom Lovejoy at the Smithsonian Institute, they said, "The committee is in agreement that the conception and construction of Biosphere 2 were acts of vision and courage. The scale of Biosphere 2 is unique, and Biosphere 2 is already providing unexpected scientific results not possible through other means, notably the documented unexpected decline in atmospheric oxygen levels. Biosphere 2 will make important scientific contributions to the field of biochemical cycling, the ecology of closed ecological systems, and restoration ecology." Columbia University assembled outside scientists to evaluate the potential of the facility after they took over its management and concluded a group of world-class scientists got together and decided that the Biosphere 2 facility is an exceptional laboratory for addressing critical questions relative to the future of Earth and its environment. So, I would be interested to know what you all think about this experiment. I think it's really interesting because I would have loved. I researched a lot of articles about what went on in the inner dynamics, and it seems like part of the issues were really just confinement, and people can't handle being confined. I think we can all relate to that now, especially being in quarantine. I don't know if everyone else is. I know my area still is under pretty heavy quarantine where you only go out when absolutely necessary. And when you do, gloves, mask, all of that. So I think we're all feeling that a little bit of being prolonged in an enclosed environment. And we don't have any scientific experiments we're running, so I think it's easy to see how that's a major stressor on it. So I would love to know what you all think about this experiment and whether or not you think it is a failure, if it had merit, if it's just a bunch of hooey. I would love to know your thoughts on it. Personally, I think it provided a lot of research on what not to do, which is sometimes more valuable than a successful experiment. We learn more, I think, from our failures than things that go right. If it had gone right, potentially we would have never learned more about that dynamic of when you've got two groups of high-ranking, very educated people together, they still couldn't make it work. And also about how much more we need to learn about Earth's ecosystems before we attempt to go colonize another planet and create a utopia there, because clearly we don't know enough about it yet, about how to recreate those conditions. So, successful failure, I would call it. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this little break from true crime. I am researching some more cases, but I wanted to get some content up for y'all, so let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts on this particular experiment, or if you have any other information on it. There was a lot of really very dry content that was available, but I just felt like it would be more interesting to do an overview of the experiment and focus more on the people than the dynamics of carbon dioxide within the biodome. So anyway, I hope everyone's staying safe, staying healthy, and I will see you next time. Have a great night.